Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Today I will be discussing my top 10 literary detective sidekicks. And I used a broad definition of sidekick here. I am considering a sidekick to be any recurring character who assists the main detective in a story. So they may not all be professional sidekicks, so to speak. They can be professionals, but they may also be the main police inspector or a family member or a friend or whoever. But before I get started, make sure you hit that subscribe button to keep up to date with the channel. I'll start with some honorable mentions, and like I did with my detectives list, there are quite a few here. I considered both Mycroft Holmes and Inspector Lestrade from the Sherlock Holmes stories, but they simply didn't make the cut. I also considered three of Lord Peter Wimsey's sidekicks in Harriet Vane, Charles Parker, and Mervyn Bunter, but they didn't make the list. Hercule Poirot had two sidekicks who did make the list, but also two who didn't, in Inspector Japp and Miss Lemon, who are both better in the adaptations, in my opinion, than in the books. Two other Christie sidekicks in Albert Bat from the Tommy and Tuppence stories and Sir Henry Clithering from Miss Marple were in consideration. Two fathers of detectives in Inspector Queen and Fenton Hardy narrowly missed the list. Another of Ellery Queen's sidekicks in Sergeant Velly also narrowly missed making the top 10. John F.X. Markham from the Philo Vance books was also very close. From the Myron Bolidar series, I considered both Esperanza Diaz and Win Lockwood, with Win essentially being number 11. He didn't make the final cut because his tendency towards violence is rather gratuitous at times, so I felt that knocked him down a bit. Starting the list off at number 10, and I did debate over whether or not to include this person as a sidekick, as this person works quite a bit more independently than the others, and actually only appears in two novels, which does technically meet the criteria of a recurring character, but that is Miss Climpson, who assists Lord Peter Wimsey in both Unnatural Death and Strong Poison. And I find both of Miss Climpson's appearances to be absolutely delightful. She does a lot of the legwork, particularly around women. I think her appearance in Strong Poison is one of the best things about the book, where she somehow is inexplicably a member of Harriet Vane's jury, but also performs this ridiculous fake seance in order to extract information from these gullible people. And this is one of my favorite scenes, really, in any mystery novel. It's such a gem. And Miss Climpson is somewhat akin to Miss Marple. She actually predates Miss Marple. However, she is a private inquiry agent and a very good one at that. She uses her position as a woman in the 1920s to extract information, and she represents this sort of upward mobility of women during this era. She's essentially a self taught woman in her field. She never married, and she is fully independent. It's a very unique position for a woman in 1920s England, and I think she's also delightful to read. So Miss Climpson comes in here at number 10. Number 9 is a sidekick to someone who didn't make my top 10 detectives and quite frankly wasn't really that close to making the list, and that is Frank Abbott from the Miss Silver series. And Miss Silver's other sidekick, her former pupil Randall March, wasn't even in consideration, to be honest. And Frank Abbott is so much better. I love his adoration for Miss Silver and how he hangs on her every word. I love how he teases her about being a witch or being psychic, and she just doesn't have any of it. I think Frank Abbott is the best character Patricia Wentworth wrote. He's a lot better than even Miss Silver. We know so much more about Frank Abbott. I love his tales about his many relatives and how he can stay anywhere in England without accruing a hotel bill because he just has relatives teeming all over the place. I think his fondness for Miss Silver is very reminiscent of the fondness one has for one's antecedents, and he does poke fun at her sometimes, which usually results in a "my dear Frank," which is essentially Miss Silver swearing. He's also technically the sidekick to Inspector Lamb, and that relationship is a lot of fun as well, where he's always trying to speak French around him, and that just bothers his boss. And his detection skills are pretty strong. I mean, psychics tend to lack in this area sometimes, but Frank Abbott isn't one of those. I do think he lacks that sort of special trait that makes him stand out a bit, but I think he's a wonderful character who places here at number 9. Number 8 is the only other sidekick who is a sidekick to someone who wasn't on my top 10 detectives list. And I'll admit, I'm not really sure how to pronounce this person's name, despite having read these books many times, and that is Albert Campion's sidekick, Magersfontein Lug. And Lug is really like no other sidekick. He's a former criminal hobnobbing around with Albert Campion, this affable aristocrat. Lug is a former burglar, and his interactions with Campion are just so much fun, where they're totally from totally different classes, and they clash constantly over this. Lug sometimes tries to better himself and make himself fancier, while Campion just simply doesn't care about any of this. I love how protective he is of Campion, and generally disapproves of Campion getting himself into like the seedy criminal underworld. And his detective skills are pretty good too. I think more so than many detective sidekicks, Lug really is an assistant to the detective. And while these are all technically so, Lug is very much in the employ of Campion. Others will talk about frequently act independently or have their own ideas, which I also enjoy. But in terms of being a sidekick, I think Lug is probably one of the most on the side. Maybe there are one or two others, but I always found Lug to be a gem who comes in here at number 8. At number 7, and I'll admit, I actually think this person might be too high. It's not that I'm not fond of this person, but I just don't like this person as much as many other people do. But I did feel he earned his place on the list, and that is Captain Arthur Hastings, sidekick to Hercule Poirot. And I enjoy Hastings' relationship with Poirot, as I've spoken about in other videos, but I've always found Hastings alone kind of annoying. He's not very intelligent, and he always gets everything wrong, which I admit is part of his charm and why I do have him here at number 7. I love how poor of a judge of character he is, and how his misinterpretation of facts is often a clue unto itself. I think Christie uses Hastings very well in the novels he appeared in to send the reader down the wrong path, but I always saw Hastings as more of a tool to advance the story rather than an independent, well fleshed out character. I think I would struggle to read through a book that featured just Hastings and not Poirot, which I wouldn't with any of the other 9 on this list. Now, I do like Hastings. I really do. I wouldn't have put him on the list otherwise, but I do think he has more flaws than the other characters who did make this list. But his upsides are there too. I think he used well in the novels, and I also feel his ill-fated romances and business ventures are really quite humorous. I think Hastings is a lot of fun, but his skills as a detective do lack, and I also feel he's more the butt of the jokes than anything else, so he does come in here at number 7. Number 6 is the other sidekick of Hercule Poirot who made the list, and that is Ariadne Oliver. And in every appearance she makes, Mrs. Oliver brings the absolute zaniest moments of those books. Largely, this is because Mrs. Oliver is essentially a stand in for Agatha Christie, and through whom Christie offers her own personal opinions, thoughts, and observations. She is comic relief in some ways, but she's not really outrageous, despite her tendency to be scatterbrained or just a mess overall. I love how she's always losing things and forgetting people, including like pretty major people in her life, like her godchildren and some clients she sent to Poirot. And I think really makes Mrs. Oliver work, in addition to her being Christie's mouthpiece, is that she works as something of a stand in for the readers as well. She is not a professional detective, she's a mystery writer, and I do feel that readers live vicariously through her. Mrs. Oliver's detection skills are somewhat mixed. She does generally do good work, but sometimes she often gets there in really convoluted ways where she goes off on women's intuition or just like who she would think is a murderer in one of her books. She's competent, entertaining, and relatable. The reason why I don't have her higher on the list is because I think there's another sidekick very similar to Mrs. Oliver who functions in the same way but also does more. So I put Mrs. Oliver here at number 6. Number 5, and this is who comes to mind, I think, when most people think of detective sidekicks, and that is Dr. John Watson, sidekick and roommate of Sherlock Holmes. And Dr. Watson's one of the more developed sidekicks out there. He is the narrator of the stories, which was very common at this time to have like first person narrator be the sidekick. Hastings functions in the same way. He is probably the most useful sidekick on this list, being a doctor and no slouch in detection either, but his relationship with Holmes is what propels him this high. We see their friendship from the very beginning, and they are initially somewhat cool to each other, but over time, Watson really becomes Holmes' close friend, and Watson is protective of Holmes as well. He records all of Holmes's interesting cases because he's mad his friend isn't getting the public recognition he deserves. What we know of Holmes comes almost entirely through Watson's perspective, and I think this friendship is one of the most enduring in detective fiction, if not of all literary fiction. Watson does get annoyed with Holmes, which is relatable, and most importantly, Watson is intelligent. Very few sidekicks are unnaturally intelligent, and Watson does lack the sort of ingenuity and creative thinking which allows Holmes to stump him repeatedly. But this happens without Watson coming across as something of a doofus like Hastings or even like Lug do on occasion. And I think Watson is a fantastic character. However, I don't have him higher on this list because I do think he lacks something special in the line of entertainment value. I don't find him as exciting or humorous to read as some of the other sidekicks. And I think my affection from him also comes somewhat from the future adaptations of him, which I try not to let influence my decision on this list. So Watson comes in here at number 5. Number 4, and spoiler alert, 3 of these top 4 are all sidekicks to the same person. And the first of these appears at number 4, and that is Nigel Bathgate, occasional sidekick to Roderick Allen. And I always thought it was a shame that Niall Marsh dropped Bathgate about a third of the way into the books, as I really enjoyed him, but you can tell that Marsh was starting to move in a different direction and just didn't really care about him anymore. Nigel is a journalist who Allen uses to extract information. Nigel somehow plausibly finds himself caught up in a bunch of cases either through chance or his own natural curiosity. I love the way Bathgate and Allen work together, where they exchange information, and Nigel is always sure to make sure he gets his scoop, often exclusively, once Allen approves of it. And there is some tension between the two here because they each want to get their jobs done while also maintaining their friendship with each other. I love the scene where they first meet and a man lay dead, where Nigel is somewhat intimidated by Alan and actually confesses to murdering his cousin for really no reason. And Alan just completely dismisses this. And the two become quick friends. And Nigel does marry Angela, and their friendship continues both professionally and personally. And I would have liked to have seen more of Nigel later on in the series to see where this relationship went, but he's just sort of removed without fanfare, unfortunately. And because of his lack of an end story and continuation, he really can't be higher than here at number 4. At number 3 is another sidekick to Roderick Allen, and that is his wife, Agatha Troy, the painter. And this is who I was referring to earlier when I was talking about someone who is a better version of Ariadne Oliver. Agatha Troy also serves as a mouthpiece for her creator, but she also functions plot-wise. She is often just as much in the thick of things as Roderick Allen. She actively investigates in a number of stories, like A Clutch of Constables, for instance. She comes across as a competent detective, but one really unsure of how to go about her way, and this is how I think someone like Agatha Troy would actually act in real life in these situations. Her relationship with Alan is one of the best in detective fiction. Their first meeting aboard a ship is fantastic, where they each think they have insulted each other and they have feelings for another, but they also sort of like dislike each other as well. It's such a ball of emotions. And then we get to the thick of things in Artist in Crime, where Troy is technically a suspect and her mixed feelings for Alan resume. She hates that he's a policeman because she hates the death penalty, but she also admires his work as well, and especially him. And he also sometimes hates that he's a policeman and he gets like really embarrassed when he has to like rummage through her underwear drawer, which is kind of funny and also a little endearing as well. And eventually they marry and become partners in multiple ways. They continue to investigate together, they are parents, they are companions, and Agatha Troy also functions independently without Alan. She is often investigating on her own, and she has her painting endeavors as well. I always loved her obsession with the shape of people's heads she wants to paint, where there's chapters of her talking about people's heads. And I think Agatha Troy is underrated as well when it comes to sidekicks, so she finishes in the top 3 here at number 3. At number 2, and this is who I personally think of whenever someone mentions stereotypical detective sidekicks, and that is Archie Goodwin, sidekick to Nero Wolfe. And to me, Archie is the quintessential small town Midwesterner who winds up in the gritty streets of New York to find himself in all kinds of crimes and situations. He is technically Wolfe's secretary, but he is, in practice, doing all of the legwork for Wolfe, so much so that some readers consider Archie to be the true protagonist of the series. Archie pretty much does all of the action, all the physical work. He is also something of a Casanova, proposing marriage to any pretty woman who meets his eye. His relationship with Wolfe is also delightful. Archie is critically underpaid, which leads to some wonderful moments when he confronts Wolfe about this, and Wolfe just thinks Archie is lying all the time. I just love Archie as a character, and I think he's probably the best first person narrator in a detective novel. He does such a fantastic job of telling the story, and while he does occasionally neglect to convey certain information, the way he tells his stories are always exciting. Maximum suspense without having a lot of unnecessary details and descriptions of things. I would have put Archie at number one, but the reason I didn't is because his character details are inconsistent. Now, Rick Stout was not really concerned with continuity, so that leads to a number of conflicting statements about Archie, specifically like his family life and his childhood. But I think Archie is a top tier character and the quintessential sidekick, so he comes in here at number two. And at number one, and this is sort of a weird one because I don't think many people actually think about this sidekick very often, but here at the top spot, I do have Inspector Fox, who is the right-hand man to Roderick Allen. And I find Fox just absolutely delightful. I think every time he's on the page, I'm just smiling at his personality or his antics. He is a blue-collar detective who is best friends with the aristocratic Allen, very similar to like Lug and Campion's relationship. And I love Fox's attempts to better himself by learning French, which really becomes like an ongoing joke throughout decades of works. Fox is known to be the best detective when it comes to questioning the ladies who work downstairs, essentially the female help. And while we don't often get to see Fox in action, when we do, it's delightful. He is a very competent detective and who works slowly but surely. You can always count on Fox to make good observations and one or two boneheaded ones that often turn out to be true, or at least like partially true. It's his charm and humor that puts Fox at the top of the list, but I don't want to ignore his relationship with Alan either. He's very protective of Alan, and Alan names Fox as Ricky's godfather. There is a sense of camaraderie between Alan and Fox where they're always joking around, but also getting their work done efficiently. Fox also has a fun relationship with his own underlings and Bailey and Thompson and some of these like other unnamed characters where he really just bosses them around and gives them orders, and it's all done to assist Alan and making sure Alan looks good. And Fox is not only a fantastic sidekick, but a good friend, a humorous presence, so he earns the top spot here at number one. And that is it for this week's video. Next time, I will begin a three-part series ranking every Miss Silver novel by Patricia Wentworth, with the bottom ranked third. And I will say, I had not read these books prior to this time around, and it was something of a rough go, but I'll talk about that in the videos. And I do have some other authors on deck, but I do have to reread their books before I feel like I can rank them efficiently, such as like Dorothy Sayers or Rex Stout. But anyway, stay tuned for those and make sure you like and subscribe this video. Until next time, History Files.